So I grew up on the south side of Chicago at the beginning of a time when everything was changing economically. Factories were closing, there were cutbacks in public services and government jobs, and it really went from being a strong working middle class, almost entirely Black neighborhood, to really seeing the bottom fall out economically. And that experience really shaped my life, my sort of middle grade experience of seeing economic inequality and devastation. And it set me on a path that would lead me to working in a world of public policy where people try to research and study problems in the American economy. And then we tried to develop solutions to those problems, problems like the rising cost of college, jobs that don't pay enough, that kind of thing, the things that keep working families of all races up at night. And I loved my career. I spent nearly 20 years helping to build and then running a think tank that worked on all of those kinds of economic issues. And yet in 2017, I decided to quit my dream job and hit the road in search of an answer that I simply wasn't finding in the research that I was doing, the economic and statistical analysis, the legislative drafting, the lobbying on Capitol Hill. I needed to find the answer among everyday Americans from all walks of life across the country. And so that journey was a 3-year journey that took me from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again multiple times. And what I was really searching for was the answer to a question that your audience and you may have asked yourselves at some point in your lives, which is, why does it seem like we can't have nice things? And by nice things, I don't mean, the hovercraft that we were supposed to be all scooting around on at this point in history. I mean, nice things like a really great, well-funded public school in every neighborhood. Nice things like universal childcare and paid family leave so that families aren't so stressed out. Nice things like a robust response to the existential threat of global climate change, right? Why does our politics seem so backwards and dysfunctional? Why can't we just all have decent lives and do what we know is in our best interest collectively to move forward as a society? And I know that particularly young people, young people who see so much dysfunction, so much hate and tragedy and crisis in our politics through social media, have asked themselves that question. And so I wrote the book, The Sum of Us, Why Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And it came out in January of 2021. And I was really fortunate that I think it hit a nerve because it talked about the fact that it's not a Black versus white issue. It's actually all of us who suffer in a society that has these undercurrents of racism that lead to bad policymaking, bad decisions, bad behavior that ultimately makes life worse for everyone. And then I had the chance to be able to adapt the book for middle grade readers. And that, to me, to be honest, Rob, was like, I don't know, maybe even more important than the adult version of the book, because if I had had these ideas that I write about in the book when I was a young person, that was when I was the biggest reader. My job was to read in my adult life, but I still did not read as much in my adult life as I read. I still did not read as much in my adult life as I read as a middle grader. I always had a book in my hands. And I really feel like I would have wanted to absorb a book that helped me keep learning history, keep seeing the political debates that were happening on my TV, but have some frameworks for understanding what was really going on. And that's what I hope that the new book, The Sum of Us, adapted for young readers, which is subtitled How Racism Hurts Everyone. I hope that really gives that to young readers. And I'm really excited about it hitting the shelves now.
So I have so many questions about this book, which I absolutely love, by the way, and it does such a nice job of laying out evidence for what feels like the missing piece. That a question I've had, why can't we have nice things? Also, why do people keep voting for these politicians who clearly hold them in disdain? They hate us. They're voting against our interest. Why? They're voting against their interest. Why are they voting for them? And you painstakingly lay out time and time and time again why that's happening, and to the point where it almost just gets like, come on, dummies, didn't you read the first several chapters? Quit it. It becomes undeniable. So if you had had this book when you were young as a middle grade reader, how would it have impacted you? I know it's listed as a call to action. How are you hoping it's going to impact young readers, and what action are you hoping to call them to?
Well, young people today, of course, are in the generation that already has no racial majority, right? The most racial and ethnically diverse generation in American history. And the real question that they face as they, become the biggest also generation in the United States is, how are we going to share this country with each other? How are we going to make a multiracial democracy thrive? How are we going to get rid of racism, which, most every young person agrees is a bad thing, and yet it continues to happen, and not just in incidents of police violence, but as I argue in The Sum of Us and really show through lots of stories and individuals, telling me about their lives, as well as some economic data and history, racism is happening in ways that shape where and how we live, that shape why we have, for example, a huge burden of student loan debt, why it is that you can't always get a good school in every neighborhood, why it is that, for example, our healthcare system is so dysfunctional. They're the fingerprints of racism in each of these areas. And so what I wanted to really give young readers is both a sense of clarity, that they're not crazy, that it really could be better. And in fact, if we just come together across lines of race, roll up our sleeves and link up arms, black, white, brown, and everything in between, and say, you know what? There's an easier way. There are common solutions to our common problems in society. Pretty much every family is trying to do the same thing, right? Keep a roof over their head, make sure they can afford to see a doctor, save for the future, invest in their dreams and meet their basic needs. And the solutions to all of those things, to make sure that that dream is not unattainable, but is rather what we expect in the United States, is really us coming together and working and fighting for those kinds of solutions across lines of race. And so I want them to have the sense of clarity about where the dysfunction is coming from. And also, at least for me, when I can see what the problem is, I become a lot more hopeful than when it just feels like there's just 100 different crises that are disconnected, floating around and menacing our collective future, right? And so in the book, I also end every chapter with a hopeful story about people coming together across lines of race, taking on a powerful interest that is nonetheless no more powerful than a group of ordinary people coming together and winning.
So this version of the book is 228 pages versus the original, which is 355. So we pared it down a bit. What other changes have you made specifically to bring this message to readers 10 and up?
Yeah. So, one of the greatest things that I heard as I was doing the book tour for the adult book was when, moms and dads and caregivers would say, I listened to this audiobook on a cross-country drive with my kid last summer, or, we are reading this book as a family and talking about chapters at the kitchen table. And I was like, wow, that is fabulous. My goal for the book was to have it be a jumping off point for discussion, where there was a little bit of something for everyone. People of all different races, a school group, a church group, a work group could come together and talk, and that families could come together and talk about it. And so that essence of being a book full of stories that people can debate and talk about is still absolutely there. Um, my editor, the wonderful editor, Beverly Horowitz at Delacorte Random Children's House, who's done a number of adaptations, of big, meaty adult books, was very clear that the book had to be shorter. And also, the thing that I was really clear about is that in some ways it would have been easy because the book includes um, lots of, history, lots of research, and then lots of individual stories about Americans that help illustrate these dynamics. It would have been easy to cut out the stories, right? It's like, well, you want to get the facts in there, and the other stories, those are nice, but they're just, an illustration of these dynamics. And it was really important to me to keep the stories because when I have been out on the road talking about the book, people tell me they remember the story of the drained pool and Tommy Cummings. They tell me they remember the story of Susan Parrish, right? They name these people. They remember the workers at the Nissan plant in Canton, Mississippi. So those stories, the real human tales, were really important for me to keep in.
There is a story, and there's no nonstop horrific stories from slavery if you want to find them, but you reference one about a woman mangling a young girl who's enslaved with a rocking chair that I haven't been able to get out of my sleep since. Oh, that's something to give me fresh nightmares. Did that make the version for the younger readers?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
So I'm curious, when you're coming to young people, you want to be honest with them. You want to let them know the truth about the world that they find themselves, that we all find ourselves in. But it's a lot to lay on a young person. Hey, here's this entire horrific history. Maybe you were a little bit more optimistic about the nature of humanity overall. And some of us are great, but some of us not so much. How do you walk that tightrope of wanting to give them the facts without being so overwhelmingly so overwhelming them with so much darkness that they feel like there's no point? Why bother?
It's so interesting. I really think that the book, The Sum of Us, the most common word, if you did a word cloud of, reader responses and critics' responses to the book, hopeful, right, would probably be the biggest one. People are relentless about saying that The Sum of Us is a hopeful book. And it's interesting because I don't shy away from telling the facts and the history that so often is not included in our own educations, right? The Southern Poverty Law Center did a survey in 2018 and found that less than 10% of high school seniors could accurately name slavery as the primary cause for the Civil War. Right. So that's our baseline, is that we are woefully miseducated about our own very recent history. And that's before book bans and all of that nonsense, all of these attacks on children's freedom to learn. So I think it is important to include some of the stuff that, just shapes the world we live in today. I'm not an historian at all. And yet I realize that in order to explain where we're standing now, we have to explain a little bit of the steps we took to get here, right? Or else it doesn't really make sense. And so I include a little bit of history, but I think what's really important is that when you see the darkness, when you're not afraid of really understanding the lengths to which often wealthy, powerful elite were willing to go to keep us divided and apart from one another, that darkness also helps you see the stars, right? And by the stars, I mean the people of all races, including white people, who were willing to buck against that conventional wisdom, who were willing to stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity and fight for justice. And I think that by showing our full history, we are able to invite readers today to say, you have a moral choice. Do you want to be like the hundreds of white, young people who were shouting at Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old, as she tried to go to a school to integrate it for the first time? Or do you want to be like the hundreds of white young people who got on buses to Mississippi for the Freedom Summer, right? The choice is always ours. And so I think if you make it seem like there wasn't a whole system of laws, not just individual moral bad acts, but a whole system of laws that structured an unequal society. If we don't know that, then it's really confusing why we're in the mess we're in. The other thing I'll say, Rob, and maybe this is more succinct, is, in this book, my goal is to unite people. My goal is to show the power that comes from the concept of solidarity. The concept of solidarity is the concept of saying, Rob, you and I, Heather and Rob, we're not the same people. We, have so many differences. And yet your struggles can be ones that I support, and you can support my struggles. And in doing that, we create bonds of collective action and strength that make ordinary people with everyday struggles stronger everywhere. So that idea of solidarity, of unity, is really important, and it's a real antidote to the division. When people talk about what they fear about teaching all of America's history, the good parts and the bad parts, is that it'll be divisive. And The Sum of Us is not a divisive book. It's a unifying call to action that says that racism in our politics and our policymaking hurts everyone.